Hi, I'm Jeff Sikkenga, Executive Director of the Ashbrook Center, and this is The American Idea, where we discuss the ideas, people, and events that have made America what it is today. We believe that by understanding our history and our principles, we can better live up to the promise of the American founding and preserve our ongoing experiment in self-government. Welcome to The American Idea.
Hello, everyone. This is John Moser. I'm your host for another edition of The American Idea. This is the first time, to my knowledge, that we will be doing a podcast about a Hollywood film. I guess it's possible. Maybe Jeff has done one. I don't know, but certainly it's the first one I have done. But it's not every day that a film comes out that is so closely related to a subject in U.S. history, particularly such a pivotal moment in U.S. history, that is the development of the atomic bomb. Of course, I'm talking about the film Oppenheimer, and our guest today is David Krugler, and Dr. Krugler wrote a very good book review of the movie. Full disclosure, I have not seen the movie yet. It hasn't come to Ashland, although I'm told it's on its way, and I do intend on seeing it then. Let me tell you a bit about our guest. David Krugler is professor of history at the University of Wisconsin-Platteville. He is author of several works, The Voice of America and the Domestic Propaganda Battles, This Is Only a Test, How Washington, D.C. Prepared for Nuclear War, 1919, The Year of Racial Violence, How African Americans Fought Back. He is also a novelist. He's written 2 novels, spy thrillers, dealing with roughly the same period of history that's roughly the time of the development of the atomic bomb. Those novels are The Dead Don't Bleed, and that was followed up by Rip the Angels from Heaven. Dr. Krugler is editor of the volume of our core document series dealing with the Cold War. He is also a very popular instructor in our Master of Arts program in American History and Government. David Krugler, it's very nice to have you.
John, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm excited about this conversation on the film Oppenheimer.
Yeah, so I was very pleased to read your review. I had already been planning on seeing it, of course, but this makes me all the more anxious to do so. How is it that what makes this such a good movie? And we can discuss that. I ultimately want to talk about what makes it a good movie from the Hollywood perspective, but also what makes it a good movie from a historical perspective. Choose whatever one of those you want to start with.
I think one way to answer that is to combine the questions. This is a rare film that serves the needs of a Hollywood audience while also doing good deeds in history. And whenever we think about a historical film, we have to be careful not to fall into the trap of saying, well, how realistic is it? Are these details historically accurate? Obviously, we need some verisimilitude. We need some accuracy. We can't have a film about the Civil War in which the actors are running around with firearms that are historically inaccurate, anachronistic, say.
AK-47s, yeah.
Right, yeah. That, I mean, if you want to do steampunk, fine. But if you're trying to show a historical event as it happened, as we understand it, there needs to be that level of detail and that accuracy. But to try and tell the story of history within the genre of film in the ways that we do as historians, with our facts and our footnotes and our sources and our interpretation, our context, that's not something that film does particularly well, not often. In this case, we see it being done. And I'll frame it this way. The writer Tim O'Brien, in his classic collection of stories, The Things They Carried, which is based upon his real-life experiences as a U.S. combat soldier in Vietnam. In those stories, O'Brien, as a character, says we need to understand there is story truth and then there is happening truth. Happening truth is historical accuracy. It's the facts. Is it possible to tell good stories if you're fixated only on happening truth? His answer is no. What you need to focus on is story truth. whether or not the details are precise, whether or not the things depicted actually happened, if you find them believable and they convey a very real story truth, or what we might call a historical truth, then we have something that is very useful to us as historians and also as film viewers. And I think the Oppenheimer film does that.
And is that because this happy convergence, is it mainly because of O'Brien's skill, or is it the nature of the subject?
It's both. So in that book, The Things They Carried, we see it in O'Brien's skill as a storyteller, and the ways in which he plays with the reader. This is especially evident in the story How to Tell a True War Story, which really undermines the classic notion of what a good war story is, and gets us to understand the complexities and the nuances, and the meaninglessness of war. Turning it to Oppenheimer, I think what we see going on here is that Nolan has done a deep dive into the historical monograph on which the film is based. The Pulitzer Prize-winning biography published in 2005, American Prometheus, The Triumph and Tragedy of J. Robert Oppenheimer by Kai Bird, and the historian Martin J. Sherwin, who is now deceased. Having read that book and then seen the film, I'm struck in a good way at how Nolan has brought out the historical details and flourishes that capture Oppenheimer as a complex personality and in vivid ways. At the same time, Nolan is willing to take risks or make changes to what actually happened in order to meet the needs of a Hollywood film. Let me give a specific example.
Please.
In real life, Oppenheimer, as a young student in Cambridge, he was a brilliant young man, but he was lonely, suffering some psychological troubles, and he made a rash and risky decision to doctor an apple that his tutor, with whom he was having problems, would most likely eat. So there's strong metaphorical significance, right? The poisoned apple. And in real life, he was caught and he was almost expelled. In the movie, we have this wonderful scene where Killian Murphy, playing Oppenheimer, wakes up and he regrets what he's done, and he rushes to the classroom to take the apple away before the tutor can bite into it. It's prominently displayed on his desk. It so happens that Niels Bohr, the Danish physicist, is visiting and he's talking with Oppenheimer's tutor, and it's Bohr who picks up the apple. And we have this dramatic moment where Oppenheimer has to grab the apple rudely out of Bohr's hand so that he's not sickened by the doctored apple. And this is explained by him saying, "Oh, there's a wormhole in the apple," which is cute by two half, but we have this
the physics.
Physics. Yeah. Unintended.
Was Bohr even there historically at this time?
Bohr was, I don't think, present at Cambridge. He might have been. I mean, I think he was to give a lecture. That may be historically accurate, and that this is just a fine grain detail. I don't have them at the tip of my mind. But let's say he wasn't there. I mean, it's still a great dramatic moment, and we do know that Bohr and Oppenheimer had lots of interactions. So that's story truth, right? So even if the details don't line up, that's just fine, because the story truth we get is that they had a relationship, and that Oppenheimer, struggled psychologically and emotionally while he was learning physics.
And we know that the basic incident of the apple happened. Right, so it's not a complete fabrication,
right?
But it is presented the way it is presented. Well, and frankly, if the way this was resolved is he was caught as opposed to grabbing it before it could do harm, he is obviously portrayed as a much less sympathetic character.
Right. Yes, that's right. That's a great observation. We see growth of the character as he goes through his struggles, which is what all good stories should do in one form or another.
Now, one thing that you make clear in your review is that the movie frames the story in terms of the hearings to determine if he was going to maintain his security clearance. 1954, the Atomic Energy Commission. Why did the director, screenwriter, whoever's decision ultimately that was, why choose that framing? What makes that important and powerful?
Well, we can assume that Christopher Nolan, as the director and having a strong part in the writing of the screenplay, gave this a lot of thought, and there's intentionality in the choice. I think it's a risky one, because for all the glamour we associate with the Red Scare, and it's not all good glamour, right? But we think of, these dramatic moments of senators thundering they have a list, and people being grilled under Klieg lights in televised hearings. But the reality is that much of the Red Scare was a very dreary affair, in which people are being asked highly pedantic questions about prior associations. They're often not able to remember, or they don't want to answer. And so it becomes a grueling dynamic. And that's not going to play well on film. I wouldn't think so, but Nolan makes it work for a few reasons. One, he has a superb cast, and we should talk a little bit later about how well Killian Murphy, the Irish actor, does as Oppenheimer, and also Robert Downey Jr. as Louis Strauss. But in terms of a narrative choice, it allows Nolan to do lengthy flashbacks and then have a running event. So we can come back to the hearings, and when Oppenheimer's asked questions about his past and his associations with known communists, that provides a segue into these lengthy scenes filmed in color about those episodes in Oppenheimer's life. And that also takes us to Los Alamos, through the Manhattan Project, and even through the use of the bombs and Oppenheimer's time with the AEC prior to this hearing in 1954.
Yeah. So the upshot, I don't know how much I know this much without having seen it. I know this from the history that Oppenheimer did lose his security clearance over this. What was it exactly? You suggest in your review that there is a certain amount of vagueness that remains about why exactly that happened to him. Certainly, it's a pivotal event. It's the end of his work for the U.S. government, the end of his formal work as a nuclear physicist or theoretical physicist. What really drives it? I mean, I'm going to stop there and just let you go with that.
I think what drives it is that once Oppenheimer had fulfilled a task that he was singularly suited to do, he had the knowledge of physics to oversee the construction of a workable bomb, but he also had sufficient administrative skills and the ability to soothe difficult personalities to bring the team together. And so once he completed this extraordinary task, his usefulness diminished a great deal. And because Oppenheimer was an outspoken opponent of the development of thermonuclear or hydrogen bombs, this further sidelined him. Add to it the intensity of the Red Scare, and I think we can say 53, 54 is the peak. This is when McCarthy is doing his most damage, and his fall comes starts in 1954. He's dead within a few years, but that period, 1953 to 1954, is really the peak of the Red Scare, and Oppenheimer gets caught up in that. And because his associations with communists were well known, even at the time he was recruited, there was a lot to work with in terms of his opponents bringing him down. I wouldn't go so far as to say he was made a sacrificial lamb, but I do think that his diminished usefulness, as well as the intensity of the Red Scare, created a situation in which there was no happy outcome for him. And the film does a really good job of showing Oppenheimer clinging to the belief that this hearing is a fair proceeding. And Emily Blunt, as his wife, sees through this. Now, Kitty Harrison, Oppenheimer's wife, was for a long time a communist, a formal member of the Communist Party. You know, and that's one of the troubles Oppenheimer is in, because he's married to a former communist. In the film, we're shown her sparring heatedly with one of Oppenheimer's inquisitioners. In real life, a man named Roger Robb, R-O-B-B. In the movie, he's played by Jason Clarke. And she just will not back down from Clarke, because she understands this is, you know, the fix is in. He's going to lose his security clearance. They might as well go down fighting. And she's really frustrated that Oppenheimer does not fight, because he apparently believes that he can come out of this with his security clearance. But she sees what he does not, that the fix is in.
Before we continue with our conversation, I'd like to have one of our faculty members tell you about a special documents-based graduate program for teachers of American history, government, and civics.
I'm Dr. John Moser, professor of history at Ashland University and chair of the Master of Arts in American History and Government program. The MAG program is for teachers who want to master their craft by building content knowledge from original documents, from the words of those who lived and shaped our history, and not from textbooks or lectures. Our program is built around the discussion of original sources, and our faculty, both from both Ashland University and from across the country, is committed to this approach. We believe that the best way to get to know our past is to have a conversation with those who were there: James Madison, Frederick Douglass, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Theodore Roosevelt, and so many more. We offer 2 programs for working teachers and a broad selection of core and elective courses. You can learn more at tah.org/programs.
When you say fight, do you mean defend these communist ties, or to say that well, that was a time of my life that's in the past, and this does not affect my loyalty to the United States?
It does not affect my loyalty to the United States. I don't think that Kitty in real life was saying to Oppenheimer, well, you know, let's just make an apology that we made youthful mistakes. Mm-hmm. She's going to the next level and saying, there was nothing wrong with what we did. You know, in the context of the times, we made choices to support this ideology because we thought it could fix glaring problems we saw. We should establish that Oppenheimer was not a member of the Communist Party, but he had people in his immediate, intimate world who were his brother, Frank, for example, and of course his wife, Kitty. And he attended meetings in which communist members were present. His license plate was taken down by the FBI. This is, you know, all in his security file before he's even selected to be director of the Manhattan Project in Los Alamos. But I think what she's saying is, you need to be upfront and proud of what you've done. And that the fact you're married to a former communist, your brother was one, or that you went to these meetings, it did not, as you said so nicely, John, affect your loyalty whatsoever. There's a great scene where Edward Teller is at the hearing and he's asked to assess Oppenheimer. And he leads by saying, you know, I have no doubt that Robert is a loyal citizen of the United States. But, and this is when the other shoe drops, Teller damningly questions some of the judgments that Oppenheimer made. And what's really great about the film is that if you've been paying attention to the relationship between Teller and Oppenheimer at Los Alamos, you know that Teller wanted to dedicate his time and talents to the planning of a thermonuclear weapon. Now, that was not going to be useful in the short term to produce a weapon at Los Alamos. But Teller was an obstinate individual, and Oppenheimer, in a great scene in the movie, says, look, you can just work on it all you want. We'll talk once a week about it. And I think in that scene, in the hearing, what Teller is saying to the security board is, I think that Oppenheimer made bad decisions about the physics we pursued. or some of the decisions about the project. But what the board hears is that Oppenheimer made bad decisions about personnel.
Very interesting.
And it's, the record does not show, I mean, there's no evidence whatsoever that Oppenheimer knew the level of Soviet espionage within the Los Alamos project. That
and we know that Teller went on to be father of the hydrogen bomb.
Right. Teller sort of becomes, Oppenheimer 2.0.
Yeah.
I mean, he kind of replaces him, sort of like Paul Nitze replaces George Kennan in terms of putting together basic Cold War policies in the early years of the Cold War.
Well, maybe let's talk about Killian Murphy's portrayal of Oppenheimer. On the one hand, when I first heard he had the role, that's strange. He's best known to I think most people as the lead in Peaky Blinders. This is obviously a very different kind of character. Although it has to be said that haunting image of him with his hat really puts you in mind of that famous photo of Oppenheimer. But in many ways, he seemed to me anyway like an odd choice. What does he bring to the role?
He thoroughly inhabits Oppenheimer as a character. He captures the contradictions. Oppenheimer was someone who could be highly sensitive, but also callous. He could be open-minded, but then narrowly focused. He was so consumed by his work that his personal relations suffered, even as he recognized his failings as a husband and as a father. And as an actor, Killian Murphy captures this with precision and also gentleness. There's no overacting, there's no gesticulation. He's a very quiet actor, and he moves fluidly, and he really, I think, captures Oppenheimer in this way. And Oppenheimer was famously painfully thin. I don't think he weighed more than 130 pounds at any point in his life, and he was 5'9" or 5'10". And so, Killian Murphy still has, an actor's physique, but he's able to convey that gauntness. Oppenheimer famously didn't like to eat. I mean, people had to remind him to eat. He was just so singularly focused on his work and his obligations. And Killian Murphy just shows how the process of leading the team at Los Alamos, and then his guilt and the pain he feels about all the lives lost as a result of the use of those bombs, like how it wears him down. He's able to show this through just facial gestures. It's really incredible.
This is something that's fascinating to me, not particularly about the performance, which I haven't seen, but about Oppenheimer, the man. He is not like Leo Szilard, who tries to organize opposition to the use of the bomb before it's done. And in fact, to all accounts that I have read, he was delighted that it tested and then that it worked against the Japanese. And then it's only after that he develops his regrets. Maybe I have that wrong, or maybe the film portrays it differently. But what is it that causes him to have this change of heart?
Well, it's the events that are taking place as the bomb is being built. And you described nicely the dynamic. For Oppenheimer, the possibility the Germans might develop such a weapon was absolutely horrifying. And he gives himself over to the project because he is absolutely set on preventing the Germans from obtaining a nuclear weapon. And think about, a nuclear bomb in the hands of Hitler. Once it's determined that the Germans are not going to complete a workable weapon, they've made a bad choice about the research, the attention turns to Japan. And so this is when I think Oppenheimer starts to, I won't say waffle, but begin to think a little bit more critically about the repercussions of developing nuclear weapons. But what keeps him on the side of doing it is in large part because Japan is still fighting. And so if this weapon can be used to end the war with an enemy that shows no sign of quitting, then that needs to be done. There's also the element of the challenge, right? I mean, we know that the bomb works, but Oppenheimer and his team did not know whether it was going to work. And there were relentless trials and tribulations and difficulties and uncertainties attending every step of the way, right up until the moment of the Trinity test on July 16th, 1945. So this shows the complexity of Oppenheimer. I mean, he's driven by this motivation that, well, we've got to end the war, but also let's see if we can do this. And then once the bombs are used, I think there's another level of or another effect on Oppenheimer's thinking. What if we have an arms race? You know, the next war, if it's fought with these weapons, will be the last war because there will be destruction. That's why he devotes himself toward or advocates international control of atomic energy, because he believes this is the only way to avoid a globally destructive conflict in the future that will wipe out humankind. So we have this evolution of his thinking, which I think the film does really well, because that could be rendered in a very black and white way, and it's not.
Okay. The film sets up as Oppenheimer's arch nemesis, Louis Strauss, played by Robert Downey Jr. Can you tell us a bit about the nature of the conflict between these two men, and then how Downey portrays Strauss?
Sure. So Louis Strauss is depicted in the movie in 1959, when he was nominated late in Dwight D. Eisenhower's second term to be Secretary of Commerce. And that's an important contextual fact, because it means Strauss is only going to be Commerce Secretary for a year and a half or so. But he sees this as the icing on the cake of his career, which included service as an admiral and also as director, the first director of the Atomic Energy Commission. In terms of his relationship with Oppenheimer, in the film, we are shown that Strauss was a great admirer of Oppenheimer and tried to recruit him to be a physicist at the New School when Strauss was running it. And it's there he develops a grudge against Oppenheimer. The film shows us that Strauss believes he was slighted by Oppenheimer, but the real source of the conflict is that Strauss is pushing the development of the so-called super thermonuclear weapons, and Oppenheimer is resisting him. Strauss is also rankled that Oppenheimer did not consider, or even will not consider, after revelations of atomic espionage, that the Soviets might have obtained information about how to build their own thermonuclear weapon. So this comes out in a second set of flashbacks. The film also relies on the depiction of the 1959 confirmation hearings for Strauss. For some reason, he liked to pronounce his name Strauss, though we would say Strauss.
Oh, okay.
Typically. Yeah. And so those flashbacks set up the revenge that Strauss gets against Oppenheimer for all of these problems. And I don't want to say more than that, because that would be a spoiler. Robert Downey Jr. is brilliant. As said, the 1959 confirmation hearings as flashbacks are filmed in black and white. And I've read some commentary that Nolan chose to do so because the black and white shows fact-based events, whereas the color scenes are adapting or adding things not in the historical record. I don't think that's a distinction that should be taken too far, because the color scenes, the flashbacks growing out of the 1954 Security Board hearings, are very fact-based, even as we discussed earlier, they add certain details. That's also occurring in the black and white hearings as well. Now, what that means, because we have these black and white scenes, and they're done in a really washed out way. You don't have that richness like you see in some of the old black and white films or in black and white photos. There's a lot of washed out white and gray, and yet even working with that type of film, Robert Downey Jr. so thoroughly and chillingly conveys Strauss's animosity toward Oppenheimer. I mean, one detail that stood out to me, and I put this in the review, is they're taking a lunch break in the confirmation hearings, which is used as a moment for Strauss to tell us, an aide who's helping him with the hearings, tell him about his past interactions with Oppenheimer. And he's getting irritated. And as he cinches his tie up to go back to the hearings, it's as if he's tightening a noose around Oppenheimer's neck. And Downey just does an extraordinary job. He and Killian Murphy are just together an amazing pair. And there are a lot of scenes with them together through the flashbacks.
Details like that, I always wonder, is this just something that Downey improvised as part of his character, or is it something that the director gave him? I will probably have no way of knowing that, but certainly.
Well, let's hope they talk about it, because I would love to know, how much of that was Nolan and how much was Downey. I imagine it was the two of them working together.
Yeah. Well, no doubt.
If you're accustomed to thinking of Downey these days as Tony Stark, Louis Strauss displaces the Tony Stark character pretty well.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. Yeah, of course, Downey has a long career that spans all kinds of characters. So I'm not at all surprised to hear that he put in a terrific performance. Any final thoughts about this film? Why it's obviously made a significant impact on you. Just to sum up why everybody who is listening to this podcast should, if they haven't already done so, go out and see this film.
I think it takes a historical moment that is really well known and of course quite significant. The development of the bombs, the use of them to end the war with Japan. We're focusing on the leading personality and making that happen. There are a lot of complexities to that story. And I think what's really helpful is that people can go to this and understand that history is not always clear with easy answers, and that heroic figures have all of these other features to their personality. Louis Strauss is not entirely evil. Oppenheimer is not entirely good. And to offer another thought, I think the popular image of the Red Scare sort of revolves around the question, well, were there communists or not? And we now know, there were. The Manhattan Project was embedded with communists. But for a lot of people, it might be, well, Oppenheimer, associated with communists, so he must have been one or sympathetic to it. Yet he could be a loyal American, sympathetic to communism, and carry out this job of building an atomic bomb, which ends the war with Japan. I mean, he could, have these associations. And he gets ground up at a security hearing because there's no space then for such a person. But we can look back and say, well, he didn't fit into the box that his contemporaries were trying to put him in, and that's how history works.
Oh, terrific.
Or should work.
David Krugler, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a great conversation.
Thank you, John, and thank you, Jeremy, for having me. I really enjoyed it.
And I want to thank again our listeners for tuning in. Hollywood doesn't often get it right when it comes to history, but it sure sounds like they've done it in this case. So for The American Idea, I'm John Moser. See you next time.
Thank you for listening to this episode of The American Idea. If you enjoyed this episode, remember to subscribe at Apple Podcast, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts, and leave a 5-star review. If you want to learn more or get involved in Ashbrook's vital work, visit our website, ashbrook.org.